I stepped into the private glass elevator of Apex Innovations, holding 2 first-class tickets to Paris and a rare bottle of vintage champagne. I was ready to surprise my husband for Valentine Day. Instead, when the silver door slid open, I was greeted by the deafening sound of a company-wide celebration. My husband was standing in the center of the executive floor, passionately kissing his female CEO. He pulled away just long enough to hold up her hand, showing off a massive teardrop diamond ring to the cheering crowd. I did not drop the champagne. I did not shed a single tear. I simply pressed the lobby button, walked out to my waiting car, and legally withdrew my 80% controlling stake from his company. Within minutes, I stripped them of $560 million in operating capital and froze every joint account we shared. Half an hour later, my phone registered 150 missed calls, and someone was violently trying to kick down my front door. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to show a betraying partner exactly who holds the real power. My name is Zuri. I am 32 years old, and I have spent my entire life building an empire completely in the shadows. Growing up in the ultra-wealthy enclaves of Buckhead in Atlanta, my family worshipped appearances above all else. My parents, Desmond and Vivian, measured a person's worth by their alumni status, their country club memberships, and the designer logos plastered across their clothing. They treated my younger sister Chloe like absolute royalty because she played their high society games perfectly. They treated me like a disappointing outcast because I preferred quiet strategy over loud flaunting. They looked at my tailored neutral suits and assumed I was a struggling financial consultant. They had absolutely no idea that I was actually a highly ruthless venture capitalist operating through a web of anonymous proxy firms. I did not need to wear my wealth on my sleeve because I practically owned the sleeves they were wearing. Marcus was exactly the kind of man my parents adored. He was 35 years old, incredibly handsome, and completely obsessed with projecting an image of unrivaled success. When we got married, he was launching a tech startup called Apex Innovations. He thought he was going to conquer the corporate world, but 3 years ago, his terrible financial management brought the company to the absolute brink of bankruptcy. I loved him, or at least I loved the man I thought he was. I wanted to save his dream, but I knew his fragile male ego could never handle his wife bailing him out. So I orchestrated a silent rescue. I used one of my proxy investment firms to buy out his debt and acquire an 80% controlling stake in Apex Innovations. I even mandated the hiring of Victoria, a flashy 34-year-old executive, to serve as a puppet CEO. Marcus and Victoria spent the next 3 years giving interviews to business magazines, attending exclusive galas, and patting themselves on the back for their brilliant corporate strategies. They genuinely believed they were titans of industry. They did not realize they were simply my employees. Our marriage had grown incredibly cold over the last 6 months. Marcus claimed the company was expanding and required him to work late nights and weekends. I wanted to give him the benefit of the doubt. I wanted to save my marriage. So I planned the ultimate romantic gesture for Valentine Day. I arranged for a private jet, a penthouse suite in Paris, and drove to his office to deliver the surprise in person. When the elevator doors opened on the executive floor, the sheer scale of his betrayal hit me like a physical blow. Victoria was wearing a stunning white designer dress, clinging to my husband like she owned him. The entire office was raising champagne flutes to toast the happy couple. Marcus grabbed a microphone and proudly announced to his staff that he and Victoria were the ultimate corporate power couple, ready to take the world by storm. He looked so triumphant. He looked so invincible. He was standing on a foundation paid for entirely by my money, using my capital to buy a diamond ring for his mistress. I did not cause a scene. I did not scream or demand answers. Crying is for people who have no leverage, and I had all the leverage in the world. As the elevator doors quietly closed, shutting out the sound of their celebration, the loving wife inside me completely vanished. I stepped out of the building and slid into the back seat of my black Maybach. Before the driver even pulled out of the parking garage, I was on the phone with my lead wealth manager. My instructions were precise and devastating. I ordered the immediate withdrawal of my proxy firm entire investment in Apex Innovations. I demanded the liquidation of the $560 million in operating capital by the close of business. I called my private banker and placed a hard freeze on every single personal and business credit card Marcus possessed. I wanted the financial ground ripped out from under his feet before his champagne glass was even empty. The ride back to my luxury penthouse was incredibly peaceful. I poured myself a glass of vintage red wine and sat on my emerald velvet sofa, watching the Atlanta skyline glow in the afternoon sun. I knew exactly how long it would take for the financial system to process my requests. Exactly 22 minutes later, my phone screen began to light up. First it was one call from Marcus, then 5, then 20. The missed call notifications flooded my screen like a waterfall quickly climbing past 100. I simply watched the screen in total silence, sipping my wine. Then the heavy oak doors of my penthouse began to rattle violently against their hinges. Someone was screaming my name, pounding on the wood with such desperation it echoed through the entire hallway. The heavy pounding on the front door echoed through the high ceilings of the penthouse. I did not flinch. I took one last sip of my red wine, savoring the rich and earthy flavor, and deliberately set the crystal glass down on the marble coffee table. The brass knocker rattled so violently, I thought the wood might splinter. Marcus was out there. He was early. I had expected him to stay and bask in the adulation of his staff a little longer, soaking up the cheap applause of his employees. But apparently he could not wait to shed the dead weight of his marriage. I smoothed the lapels of my tailored silk jacket, stood up with absolute perfect posture, and walked over to unlock the heavy oak door. He shoved past me before the door was even fully open. His face was flushed with a toxic mix of adrenaline and pure arrogance. He smelled of cheap champagne and blatant betrayal. He did not look at me like a husband looks at a wife. He looked at me like a wealthy landlord looks at a nuisance tenant who is months behind on rent. He marched straight to the center of the massive living room, threw his designer leather briefcase onto my velvet sofa, and reached inside his tailored suit jacket. He aggressively pulled out a thick stack of legal documents and slapped them onto the glass table with a loud crack. The bold black letters on the front page spelled out exactly what I already knew was coming. Petition for dissolution of marriage. He stood there adjusting his custom silk tie, completely convinced he was the most powerful and untouchable man in Atlanta. "I want a divorce, Zuri," he said, his voice dripping with absolute condescension. "And I want it done quickly and quietly. Do not look so surprised. You had to know this was coming sooner or later. We are simply not on the same path anymore. You sit at home playing on your laptop doing freelance consulting for pennies, while I am out there building a global tech empire. I need a partner who matches my drive and my ambition. Someone who truly understands the immense pressure of running a multi-million-dollar corporation. Victoria is a chief executive officer. She is a visionary. She is on my level. You are just complacent and holding me back." I watched him pace back and forth across the imported Persian rug, waving his hands frantically as he justified his disgusting infidelity with empty corporate buzzwords. He genuinely believed his own delusions. He thought my quiet days working from home were spent watching daytime television and browsing online stores. He was completely unaware that I was managing a venture capital portfolio larger than the gross domestic product of a small island nation. He did not know that the very empire he was bragging about was funded entirely by my secret capital. "I need you out," he continued, pointing a sharp finger directly at my face. "I have a major charity gala to attend this weekend with Victoria, and we will be making our relationship public to the media. It is time for you to face reality and stop dragging your feet. You have coasted on my success and my money for 3 long years. Now the free ride is officially over. I am giving you exactly 2 hours to pack your clothes and get out of my house." The silence that followed his arrogant little speech was thick and incredibly heavy. The air in the room felt electric, almost suffocating, but my face remained a mask of pure ice. I did not cry, I did not beg. I did not scream. I simply turned my back on him, walked over to the hallway closet, and pulled out the matching black leather suitcase I had neatly packed 2 days ago when I first saw the financial discrepancies in his corporate expense accounts. I rolled it smoothly across the polished hardwood floor and stopped right in front of him. The look of utter confusion on his face was priceless. He expected hysterical tears. He expected me to drop to my knees and plead for a second chance to save our family. Seeing me perfectly composed completely unnerved him. I looked at him, my expression completely blank, and tilted my head slightly to the side. "You are giving me 2 hours to get out of your house," I repeated slowly, letting every single word hang in the tense air. He puffed out his chest aggressively, trying to regain his dominant posture. "Yes, my house," he snapped loudly. "The house I pay for. The house my company funds. Are you deaf, Zuri? Pack your bags and leave before I call security to have you physically removed." I smiled. It was a small, chilling, and highly dangerous smile. I crossed my arms and looked him dead in the eye, stripping away every ounce of warmth I had ever held for him. "Marcus," I said softly, my voice barely above a whisper. "Are you absolutely sure this house is in your name?" His mouth opened to speak, but no words came out. His brow furrowed deeply as his brain struggled to process the calm certainty in my question. He was about to explode. I could see the blue vein pulsing wildly in his neck, and the angry red flush creeping up his jawline. He took a threatening step forward, opening his mouth to curse me out, to scream about his highly paid lawyers and his immense wealth. But before he could utter a single angry syllable, the quiet living room was suddenly filled with a sharp, synchronized buzzing sound. My phone resting on the coffee table lit up brightly. A fraction of a second later, the phone inside his jacket pocket began vibrating violently. Then mine buzzed again, and again, and again. It was a relentless cascade of incoming notifications. We both looked down at the glass coffee table. The screen of my phone was flashing with rapid-fire text messages. It was the family group chat. My parents, my sister Chloe, and my brother-in-law Brad were blowing up the thread, and the brutal messages they were sending were about to turn this private confrontation into an all-out war. I picked up my device from the glass table. The screen illuminated the dimly lit space between us, casting a harsh blue glow over the marble surface. Marcus snatched his own phone from his pocket, his eyes darting frantically across the screen. I did not need to see his display to know exactly what he was reading. The flood of notifications on my own device told the entire pathetic story. The messages were coming from our group chat, a thread mockingly titled "Family First." My mother Vivian had fired off the first message. "Marcus, darling, we are so incredibly proud of you and Victoria. Apex Innovations is soaring to new heights. We just saw the photos from the office celebration online. You two look absolutely stunning together." Then my father Desmond chimed in right beneath her. "I always knew you were destined for greatness, son. It takes a real titan of industry to make those hard executive decisions and push a company into the future. You have our full support." The blatant disrespect did not stop there. The focus of the chat quickly shifted directly to me. Chloe, my golden child sister, typed out a massive paragraph. "Zuri, you really need to stop dragging Marcus down. He is building a global empire, and you are just suffocating him with your boring freelancer lifestyle. You sit at home all day doing nothing, while he carries the weight of the world on his shoulders. Let the man breathe and accept that he has outgrown you." As if that was not enough, Brad decided to add his useless commentary. Brad was Chloe's insufferable white husband, a man who worked as a mid-level manager at my father's firm, but strutted around like he owned the entire building. "I have been saying this for years," Brad wrote. "Marcus needs a high society woman like Victoria by his side. Someone who actually understands wealth class and corporate strategy. Zuri is just a dead weight clinging to his tailored coattails. She should be grateful he stayed with her this long." Marcus stood across from me reading the exact same messages. A smug, triumphant grin spread across his face, completely replacing his previous confusion about the house deed. He puffed out his chest, his ego inflating to massive proportions as he soaked in the validation from my own flesh and blood. He looked at me fully expecting to see me crushed, humiliated, and broken by my family's ultimate betrayal. "You see," Marcus sneered, his voice dripping with absolute malice. "Even your own parents know the truth. Your entire family sees exactly what you are. You do not belong in this world, Zuri. You never did. You are a small, insignificant person, and I am moving on to bigger things. Do not make this harder than it has to be." I stared at the screen for a long moment. I did not defend myself. I did not type out a furious paragraph explaining that I owned the very empire they were praising. I did not remind my parents that their precious son-in-law was a financial failure who had nearly bankrupted his own startup before my secret capital bailed him out. I simply tapped the text box and typed a single calm sentence. "I will be coming to Sunday dinner. I have a surprise for the whole family." I hit send and immediately locked my screen. I slipped the phone into my designer bag and snapped the golden clasp shut. I did not look at Marcus again. I simply gripped the handle of my leather suitcase and walked right past him, my heels clicking rhythmically and powerfully against the hardwood floor. "Hey!" He barked, his voice trailing after me, suddenly laced with a fresh wave of irritation because I was not giving him the hysterical reaction he craved. "I said you have 2 hours to get your junk out of my penthouse." "Take all the time you need, Marcus," I replied smoothly without breaking my stride, my voice echoing slightly in the vast entryway. "You are going to need a very comfortable place to sit when the banks open tomorrow morning." I walked out the heavy oak door and let it click firmly shut behind me, leaving him alone in the penthouse I owned in the life I had paid for. The private glass elevator took me straight down to the underground VIP parking garage. The air was cool and smelled of polished concrete and expensive exhaust. My private driver, Thomas, was standing perfectly straight beside my black Maybach. He opened the heavy rear door without a single word, his professional demeanor a sharp contrast to the chaos upstairs. I slid into the soft leather seat, the quiet, soundproof luxury of the cabin instantly enveloping me. Thomas closed the door, cutting off the sounds of the garage, and slid into the driver's seat. The city lights of Atlanta blurred past the tinted windows as we pulled out onto the main avenue, blending into the evening traffic. The ride was incredibly smooth, but my mind was operating at lightning speed. I retrieved my phone from my bag and dialed a direct, highly encrypted line. It rang only once before my lead wealth manager answered the call. "Ms. Zuri," he said professionally, his voice crisp and alert. "The liquidation of the Apex Innovations capital is complete. The funds have been fully rerouted to your offshore holding accounts, and all joint credit lines associated with Marcus have been completely frozen. He currently has zero access to any operational liquidity." "Excellent," I said, my voice as cold and precise as a surgeon's scalpel. "But we are not finished yet. I want you to look into the personal and business financial portfolios of Desmond and Vivian Carter, as well as Brad and Chloe Sterling." There was a brief pause on the line as my wealth manager processed the names of my immediate family members. "Understood," he replied. "What are your exact instructions regarding their accounts?" I leaned back against the plush leather headrest and watched the towering skyscrapers of my city passing by. "Buy up all their debt," I commanded softly. "Every single mortgage, every business loan, every private line of credit, and every outstanding car payment. Use the proxy firms to acquire it quietly. I want to own everything they owe. Absolutely everything." A slow, deliberate smirk crept across my face as the line clicked dead. The reflection in the tinted window of the Maybach showed a woman completely devoid of mercy. The drive to the financial district took less than 15 minutes, but in that short window of time, the foundation of Marcus's entire existence was systematically dismantled. My driver pulled up to a towering glass and steel high-rise. I bypassed the main reception and took the private executive elevator directly to the top floor, stepping into the sprawling corner office of my lead corporate attorney, Harrison. Harrison was already standing by his massive mahogany desk, a stack of heavily redacted files spread out before him. He was a ruthless legal predator, the kind of man who dismantled Fortune 500 companies before his morning coffee. When I walked in, he did not offer superficial sympathies about my impending divorce. He simply tapped a gold pen against a leather-bound folio and smiled. "The operational capital has been fully extracted," Harrison stated, his voice ringing with absolute precision. $560 million completely wiped from the ledgers of Apex Innovations in a matter of minutes. The sudden vacuum has triggered an automatic lockdown of all their corporate accounts. Marcus currently has zero access to payroll, vendor payments, or his own bloated executive expense accounts. The credit cards he used to buy that teardrop diamond ring for his mistress are officially declining across the city. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the glittering Atlanta skyline. "It is almost poetic," I murmured, crossing my arms. He stood in my penthouse today, puffing out his chest, bragging about his global tech empire, and calling me a useless freelancer. He truly believes he built that company with his own bare hands. Harrison let out a sharp, genuine laugh, tossing the gold pen onto his desk. The delusion of that man is truly staggering. He is completely blind to the reality of his own incompetence. 3 years ago, Apex Innovations was nothing but a sinking ship. He had mismanaged his seed funding, alienated his primary investors, and racked up massive operational debts. He was exactly 2 weeks away from filing for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. He was sobbing in my office, begging for a miracle. "And I gave him one," I replied, turning away from the window to face Harrison. The memory of Marcus 3 years ago, desperate and broken, flashed through my mind. I had loved him then. I had genuinely wanted to see him succeed. But I knew his fragile, toxic male ego could never handle the reality of his wife saving him from absolute financial ruin. If I had simply written him a check, he would have resented me for the rest of his life. He needed to feel like a titan. He needed to believe he was a self-made genius. "So you created a phantom savior," Harrison said, opening one of the thick corporate dossiers. "You authorized me to use one of your anonymous proxy venture capital firms to aggressively buy out all of his outstanding debt. You injected the exact amount of capital needed to keep the lights on, and in exchange, your proxy firm quietly acquired an 80% controlling stake in Apex Innovations. You literally bought his company out from under him, saved his pride, and let him keep his fancy title on the door. He has been your employee for 3 years, and he has absolutely no idea." I walked over to the desk, running my fingertips over the edge of the leather folio. That was not my only intervention. Marcus was a terrible leader. He lacked vision and possessed zero strategic planning skills. Leaving him in charge of my investment would have been financial suicide. I forced the proxy board of directors to mandate the immediate hiring of a highly qualified chief executive officer to oversee daily operations and keep Marcus in line. Harrison pulled out a glossy corporate photograph from the file and slid it across the mahogany surface. The photograph showed Marcus and Victoria posing for a recent business magazine cover. Victoria, the brilliant visionary CEO. I stared down at Victoria's perfectly contoured face and let out a dry, humorless chuckle. Victoria is nothing but a highly paid babysitter. I personally selected her from a pool of mid-level corporate candidates because she possessed exactly the right mix of ruthless ambition and moral flexibility. Her entire job description was to manage the actual business while stroking Marcus's ego and making him feel like he was making the big decisions. I handed her a massive salary and a prestigious title to play a role. I never expected her to take her babysitting duties straight to my husband's hotel room. "They deserve each other," Harrison noted, his tone laced with disgust. "Two massive frauds feeding off the same illusion. They have spent the last 3 years giving interviews, attending exclusive galas, and patting themselves on the back for their brilliant corporate strategies. They genuinely believe they are untouchable industry leaders. They do not realize that every single strategy they executed was handed down directly from your proxy board. They are nothing but puppets dancing on the strings you control." "And now," I said, picking up the glossy photograph and tearing it straight down the middle, "I am cutting the strings. Without my operational capital, Apex Innovations will default on its vendor contracts by tomorrow afternoon." The board will convene an emergency session. As the majority shareholder, my proxy firm will immediately demand a vote of no confidence. I want Marcus and Victoria formally stripped of their titles and physically escorted from the building by security. I want it done publicly. It is already in motion, Harrison assured me, sorting the torn pieces of the photograph into the trash bin. The corporate massacre is guaranteed. But let us move on to the secondary directive you issued from the car. This one is far more personal. Harrison pulled a separate, much thicker red folder from the bottom of the stack. He opened it carefully, displaying a complex web of financial charts, mortgage deeds, and outstanding loan agreements. The atmosphere in the room shifted, growing even more intense. This was not just business anymore. This was a targeted demolition of the very people who shared my blood. I instructed my wealth manager to coordinate directly with your firm, I said, placing both hands flat on the desk and leaning in closely. My parents and my sister have spent their entire lives treating me like a disappointing outcast. They worshipped Marcus because he projected the loud, flashy wealth they value above all else. They just applauded him in our family group chat and told me I was dragging him down. I want to know the exact status of their financial portfolios. Harrison looked up, his eyes locking onto mine with absolute professional certainty. He closed the red folder and rested his hands on top of it. He did not blink. The transactions were executed flawlessly and with extreme prejudice, Harrison stated. The debt portfolio of your family has been completely acquired. We now own your parents' primary estate mortgage, the commercial loans for your father's failing firm, and every single line of credit attached to your sister and her husband. We hold all the cards, awaiting your command to activate. The weekend passed in a blur of silent, lethal preparation. By the time Sunday evening arrived, the trap was fully set. The grand iron gates of my parents' sprawling Buckhead estate parted, and Thomas drove my Maybach up the winding, oak-lined driveway. I stepped out into the humid Georgia air, my posture perfect, my expression an impenetrable mask of absolute calm. Inside the mansion was a monument to my father's obsession with status. Crystal chandeliers threw fractured light across imported Italian marble. The heavy double doors to the formal dining room were open, and the scene before me looked like a perfectly staged royal court. Marcus and Victoria were seated at the right hand of my father, occupying the positions of highest honor. They were sipping vintage champagne, laughing loudly at something Brad had just said. I stepped into the room and the laughter died instantly. The silence was heavy and suffocating. Every eye turned toward me. My mother Vivian looked me up and down, her gaze pausing on my understated tailored clothing. Her lips curled into a sharp sneer of disapproval. Zuri, she sighed dramatically, setting her crystal flute down. I told you this was a formal family celebration. Could you really not find something decent to wear? It is completely disrespectful to show up in cheap, unbranded clothing when we have a distinguished guest like Victoria joining us. You look like a struggling secretary. I glanced down at my ensemble. It was a custom-made pure silk blouse and trousers from an exclusive Italian atelier. There were no flashy logos because true wealth does not need to scream its name. My outfit cost more than my mother's entire heavily branded designer wardrobe, but her eyes were too blinded by superficial labels to recognize true quality. I did not correct her. I simply took the empty seat at the far end of the long mahogany table, the farthest point away from the guests of honor. My sister Chloe was practically vibrating with desperate energy. She thrust her wrist into the center of the table, making sure the chandelier light caught the dazzling array of stones encircling her arm. "Look what Brad got me for our anniversary," Chloe announced loudly, her voice shrill with manufactured joy. 10 carats of flawless diamonds. He is doing so incredibly well at the firm. It is just so wonderful to be married to a man who knows how to properly provide for a woman and elevate her lifestyle. She shot a pointed, malicious look in my direction, ensuring her insult landed exactly where she intended. Brad puffed out his chest aggressively, adjusting his silk tie. He threw a conspiratorial wink at Marcus. "It is all about strategic wealth building," Brad boasted loudly. "You have to surround yourself with winners. Marcus smiled smugly, resting his hand over Victoria's on top of the table. Victoria looked at me with an expression of pure, unfiltered pity. She genuinely believed she had won. She thought she had conquered the corporate world and stolen the ultimate prize. My father, Desmond, cleared his throat loudly, tapping a silver spoon against his glass. The table fell completely silent. He stood up, looking down the length of the table with the arrogant pride of a self-proclaimed patriarch. "Tonight is a monumental evening for the Carter family," my father began, his voice booming through the dining room. "We are gathered here to celebrate innovation, corporate excellence, and the joining of two powerful visions. Marcus and Victoria have transformed Apex Innovations into an absolute juggernaut. They are the future of the tech industry, and more importantly, they are the future of this family." My mother clapped her hands together, practically weeping with joy. "Desmond, tell them the rest. Tell them the big news." My father puffed his chest out even further. "We do not just support success with our words," he announced grandly. "We support it with our capital. Next week, Brad will officially represent the Carter Family Trust and wire an executive investment of $5 million directly into Apex Innovations. We are securing our stake in a global empire." The table erupted into applause. Chloe squealed, hugging Brad. Marcus and Victoria raised their glasses, accepting the adulation like conquering heroes. They were all celebrating a $5 million investment into a company that I entirely owned. They were throwing their supposed wealth into an abyss that I controlled. I watched the pathetic display of arrogance without moving a single muscle. As the applause died down, Brad stood up. He walked slowly around the long mahogany table until he reached my seat. He looked down at me, his face twisted into a mask of utter contempt and condescension. He reached into the inside pocket of his tailored jacket and pulled out a leather checkbook. He uncapped his pen and scribbled a number on the paper, tearing it out with a sharp rip. He dropped the check directly onto my empty porcelain dinner plate and slid it toward me with a single finger. "We know you are out on the street now, Zuri," Brad said, his voice loud enough for the entire room to hear. "Marcus was generous enough to let you go without a fight. Use this to find a cheap apartment and maybe enroll in a few community college classes to update your resume. The family is moving forward and we cannot have you begging for handouts when you inevitably fail. Take the money and quietly disappear." The room felt momentarily tilted, the grand crystal chandeliers casting skewed, unnatural shadows across the faces of my so-called family. It was a dizzying display of unified malice, a warped portrait of people who thrived on tearing me down to elevate themselves. The sheer imbalance of power they perceived in this room was suffocating. I looked down at the pale blue slip of paper resting on my fine china dinner plate. $1,000, a mere fraction of what I spent on my morning coffee imported from Colombia. Brad stood there, his chest puffed out, a smug, self-satisfied sneer twisting his features. He truly believed he was displaying profound charity while putting me in my place. His posture reeked of that specific toxic entitlement he always wielded against me, an unspoken assertion that he, the successful white savior of the family, had to step in to manage the unfortunate struggling black sheep. "Take it," Brad insisted, his voice laced with a thick, patronizing authority. "Go rent a cheap studio somewhere on the edge of the city. Buy some decent groceries. Start over. Just do not smear the family image anymore by lingering around our social circles like a stray dog. You are an embarrassment to Desmond and Vivian, and frankly, Zuri, you are an embarrassment to yourself." I did not throw the check back in his face. I did not rip it to shreds in a fit of hysterical rage. I simply picked it up with two perfectly manicured fingers, folded it neatly exactly in half, and slipped it into the pocket of my silk trousers. "Thank you, Brad," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "Your extreme generosity is noted." My mother let out a sharp, dismissive sigh, clearly disgusted that I had actually taken the handout. "Well, now that the charity work is concluded," she announced, waving a hand toward the center of the table. "Let us get to the real reason we are celebrating tonight." Resting right next to my father's empty plate was a thick stack of legal documents bound in a heavy leather folder. It was the $5 million investment contract, the binding agreement that would transfer a massive portion of the Carter Family Trust directly into the gaping maw of Apex Innovations. Marcus pulled a heavy gold fountain pen from his breast pocket and laid it ceremoniously next to the contract, smiling at my father like a devoted son. I leaned forward slightly, my eyes scanning the exposed front page of the document. As the absolute owner of the proxy firm that controlled Apex, I already knew exactly what was inside that contract. Harrison had drafted it precisely to my specifications. It was not an investment, it was a financial guillotine. Before you sign that, I said, my voice cutting through the celebratory chatter like a steel blade, I would strongly suggest you turn to page 42. Section 4, subsection B. The table went dead silent again. My father frowned, his thick gray eyebrows knitting together in heavy irritation. What are you blabbering about now, Zuri? I am just reading the fine print, I replied, gesturing toward the document with absolute calm. You are investing $5 million for what you believe is a preferred equity stake. But Section 4, subsection B contains an absolute dilution clause tied directly to operational deficits. Apex Innovations is currently bleeding capital. The moment this money enters their accounts, it will automatically trigger the debt covenant. Your $5 million will not buy you equity. It will be immediately absorbed to cover outstanding vendor liabilities, and your voting shares will be instantly diluted to exactly zero. You are not buying a piece of a company. You are paying off their overdue bills and legally forfeiting any right to claim a return on your investment. For exactly 3 seconds, the dining room was completely quiet. The only sound was the ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the hallway. The tension in the air was so thick it could be sliced. Then Marcus threw his head back and let out a booming theatrical laugh. Brad joined in immediately, slapping his hand against the mahogany table. Within moments, the entire room was echoing with mocking, cruel laughter. My mother shook her head, wiping a tear of mirth from her eye, while Chloe looked at me like I was a certified lunatic. Victoria leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table, her perfectly sculpted face radiating pure condescension. "Oh, Zuri," Victoria purred, her voice dripping with venomous pity. "This is exactly why Marcus had to leave you. You truly have no idea how high-level corporate finance works, do you? You read one paragraph of complex legal jargon, and suddenly you think you are a Wall Street analyst. That clause is a standard corporate protection mechanism. It is highly advanced structural phrasing meant to secure institutional capital, not erase it." She reached over and affectionately patted my father's hand, smiling at him like a co-conspirator. "Do not listen to her, Desmond. She is an ignorant outsider trying to sound smart, using vocabulary she does not understand. She is just bitter because she is no longer attached to this level of wealth and success. It is actually quite sad to witness." My father glared at me, his face flushing with dark, embarrassed anger. "You have humiliated yourself enough for one night, Zuri. Keep your mouth shut about business matters you could not possibly comprehend. You are a freelancer who plays on a laptop all day. Victoria is a chief executive officer. I think I know who to trust with the future of the family portfolio." "You are absolutely right," I said softly, leaning back into my chair and letting the shadows of the room wash over me. I picked up my crystal water glass, feeling the cool condensation against my fingertips. I looked around the table at the arrogant, mocking faces of the people who shared my blood and the 2 corporate frauds who were about to rob them blind. I offered a small, careless shrug. "I am just an ignorant outsider. What do I know about high finance?" I took a slow, deliberate sip of my water, my eyes locking dead onto Marcus's over the rim of the glass. "Have fun signing the contract." My father grunted in agreement, thoroughly dismissing my existence. He picked up the heavy gold fountain pen, adjusted his reading glasses, and brought the nib down. The sharp metallic scratch of the pen hitting the heavy paper echoed through the room. My father lifted the heavy gold pen from the parchment, admiring his aggressive, sprawling signature. The deed was done. $5 million of the Carter family trust had just been legally committed to a financial black hole. He closed the leather folder with a resounding thud and slid it across the polished mahogany table toward Marcus. The room immediately erupted into a fresh chorus of adoring applause. My mother clasped her hands together, her eyes shining with absolute reverence for the man who was actively destroying her financial future. Chloe beamed, raising her crystal flute while Brad gave Marcus a firm congratulatory nod. Victoria, completely emboldened by her perceived victory, leaned back in her chair and clapped her hands twice. She turned her attention to Henri, the lead concierge of the elite private catering firm my parents had hired to service the extravagant dinner. Henri, Victoria called out, her voice echoing with the arrogant entitlement of a woman playing with someone else's money. This monumental occasion calls for a proper celebration. Go to the reserve cache in your transport vehicle. I want 3 bottles of the 1990 Louis Roederer Cristal Millennium. Open them immediately. Henri stepped forward, his posture rigid and highly professional. He bowed his head slightly, presenting a sleek mobile digital ledger. Of course, madam. I must inform you that the reserve vintage runs at $6,000 per bottle. The total addition to the evening's invoice will be $18,000. Victoria did not even flinch. She offered a dismissive, patronizing smile and reached into her glittering designer clutch. She pulled out a heavy laser-etched titanium credit card and dropped it onto Henri's silver tray with a sharp clatter. Put it on the Apex Innovations corporate account, Victoria commanded, casting a triumphant glance toward my father. Consider it a business expense. We are formally welcoming our newest major investor. It is the absolute least the company can do to show our deep appreciation. Henri picked up the metal card and tapped it against the screen of his mobile point-of-sale terminal. The dining room was quiet, filled only with the soft hum of classical music playing from the hidden speakers. Then the machine emitted a harsh, flat beep. Henri frowned. He adjusted his posture, wiping the chip on his pristine white apron, and firmly inserted the card into the bottom slot of the terminal. The machine processed for 3 agonizing seconds before emitting a second, much louder and far more aggressive beep. A bright red error message illuminated the screen. I sincerely apologize, Madame Henri said, his voice dropping to a discreet, hushed tone in a polite attempt to preserve her dignity. The terminal is returning an error. It says the transaction is declined. The account is completely frozen. The silence that fell over the mahogany table was instant and absolute. The cheerful, celebratory atmosphere evaporated, replaced by a thick, suffocating tension. My eyes darted rapidly across the room, taking in every single reaction. Victoria's perfectly contoured face went completely blank, her mouth dropping open in shock. My mother blinked rapidly, clearly confused by the vulgar concept of a declined card at her dinner table. That is impossible, Victoria snapped, her voice losing all its previous smooth sophistication. Run it again. The machine is obviously malfunctioning. There are tens of millions of dollars in that corporate account. I already ran it twice. Madame Henri replied stiffly, rotating the screen so she could see the glaring red letters. The issuing bank has placed a hard lock on the funds. Marcus let out a loud, forced scoff, quickly stepping in to save face. It is just a ridiculous security flag, he announced smoothly, waving his hand to dismiss the awkwardness. The bank algorithms always freeze the account when we make large, out-of-state-style entertainment purchases late on a Sunday. It is an annoying security protocol. Do not worry about it, darling. I have it covered. Marcus reached into the inside pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out his highly coveted Centurion black card. He practically threw it onto the silver tray, his chest puffing out with manufactured masculine pride. Put it on my personal account, Marcus ordered. And add a 20% gratuity for your trouble, Henri. Henri nodded, picking up the heavy black card. He tapped it against the screen. The machine beeped instantly. He inserted the chip. Another sharp, unforgiving beep echoed through the silent dining room. Sir Henri said, his voice entirely devoid of emotion now. This card is also declining. The terminal states your personal assets are frozen under a total operational lockdown. I sat at the far end of the table, resting my chin on my folded hands, watching the spectacular collapse of their fragile universe. The rapid shift in the room's dynamic was intoxicating. Marcus's face drained of all color, turning a sickly shade of pale gray. He grabbed his phone from the table, his thumb frantically swiping across the screen as he tried to log into his banking applications. The error messages on his display were visible even from where I sat. My father cleared his throat loudly, shifting uncomfortably in his high-backed chair. Well, Desmond muttered, looking toward my mother. I left my wallet in the upstairs safe. Vivian, do you have your card? My mother let out a nervous, high-pitched laugh. I only carry my daily allowance card in my evening bag, Desmond. It does not have an $18,000 limit on it. The suffocating embarrassment in the room reached a critical mass. The catering director stood patiently holding the terminal, waiting for $18,000 that nobody at the head of the table possessed. Slowly, inevitably, every single eye in the room turned toward Brad. Brad, who had just spent the last hour bragging about his massive corporate bonuses. Brad, who had just humiliated me by throwing a $1,000 charity check onto my dinner plate. Brad swallowed hard. The smug, superior grin had entirely vanished from his face, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated panic. Chloe nudged him sharply in the ribs, her eyes wide and demanding. With trembling fingers, Brad reached into his pocket and pulled out his own credit card. He handed it to Henri, his face turning an alarming shade of green as the machine processed the massive transaction and printed a long, white receipt. He had just signed away months of his personal savings to cover a wine bill for a company that was already dead. Victoria sat frozen, her eyes darting toward me. She was desperate to deflect from her own humiliation. She pointed a sharp, manicured finger in my direction. You have absolutely no right to sit there and smile. Zuri Victoria hissed, her voice trembling with misplaced rage. You are an ignorant outsider. You know nothing about corporate banking algorithms or wealth management. You are just a pathetic freelancer enjoying a momentary technical glitch. I slowly picked up my crystal water glass, the ice clinking softly against the sides. I offered her a small, effortless shrug. You are right, Victoria, I said softly, taking a calm sip of water. I am completely ignorant. I wish you and Marcus the absolute best of luck executing your new contract. Before Victoria could fire back another insult, the sharp, piercing ringtone of a cell phone shattered the tension. It was Marcus's phone. He stared at the caller ID, his eyes widening in absolute terror. It was his chief financial officer. Marcus answered the phone, bringing it slowly to his ear. He did not say a word. He just listened. I watched the remaining blood leave his face. His jaw went slack. His hand began to tremble violently. Whatever the voice on the other end of the line told him, it completely broke him. His fingers lost their grip. The heavy crystal wine glass he was holding slipped from his hand, crashing onto the Italian marble floor and shattering into 100 glittering pieces. The sound of the shattering crystal snapped the room back to reality, yet Marcus remained entirely paralyzed. He slowly lowered the phone from his ear, his hands still shaking so violently that the expensive device nearly followed the glass to the floor. His breathing was shallow and erratic, like a man who had just been shoved out of an airplane and realized he was not wearing a parachute. Victoria broke the heavy silence, her voice a shrill mixture of panic and irritation. Marcus, what is it? What did the security team say? Marcus did not look at her. He did not look at my father, who was now gripping the edge of the mahogany table, nor at Brad, who was still silently mourning his freshly decimated bank account. Marcus looked only at me. My security concierge, just called Marcus, whispered the words, scraping painfully out of his dry throat. The smart locks on the penthouse, the private gates, the elevator access. Everything has been remotely wiped. I am locked out. They said the primary deed holder triggered an immediate eviction protocol and froze all residential assets. Victoria scoffed loudly, crossing her arms defensively to shield herself from the mounting embarrassment. That is completely absurd. We own that penthouse. We bought it through the corporate trust last year. Call them back immediately and demand they fix this technical error. We do not own it. Marcus choked out, his voice cracking as the full weight of his reality crashed down on him. The proxy firm owns it, the holding company that financed the Apex expansion. They own the master lease, the deed, the physical assets. Everything was tied to the operational debt covenant. The realization hit the room in slow, agonizing waves. The proxy firm owned his home. The proxy firm controlled his company's debt. And I controlled the proxy firm. My gaze locked directly onto his, and my eyes were as cold and unforgiving as Arctic ice. He finally saw it. the absolute unyielding truth of his situation. I was not the discarded, heartbroken ex-girlfriend he thought he had left behind. I was the architect of his total destruction. He had spent the last year believing he had cleverly outmaneuvered me, stealing my initial concepts and using my own family's connections to build his hollow empire. He never realized I had quietly purchased the holding company that owned his entire life. "What did you do?" Marcus demanded, his voice rising to a frantic, high-pitched shout as he pointed a trembling finger at me. "Zuri, what did you do to my accounts?" My mother stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the Italian marble. "Marcus, do not be ridiculous. Do not speak to her like she has any power here. She is just a freelancer. She does not have the capacity or the capital to lock you out of a multi-million-dollar penthouse." I did not bother to validate my mother's desperate, frantic denial. The time for hiding in the shadows was officially over. I placed my hands flat on the table and pushed myself up, my movements smooth, deliberate, and entirely unhurried. I stood tall at the end of the table, the custom silk of my blouse catching the fractured light of the chandelier. I raised a hand and casually brushed a non-existent speck of dust from my shoulder, a gesture of absolute calculated dismissal. "Thank you all for a truly unforgettable dinner," I said, my voice ringing clear and authoritative through the cavernous dining room. The hospitality was incredibly revealing. "I highly suggest you all get some rest now. Make sure everyone gets to work early tomorrow. It is going to be a highly demanding day." I turned on my heel, ready to walk out of the suffocating dining room and leave them drowning in the catastrophic mess they had so eagerly created for themselves. "Wait!" Victoria shrieked, slamming her palms flat on the table. "You are not going anywhere. You are going to sit back down and explain exactly what kind of scam you are running." Right at that exact second, a sharp, piercing chime echoed from Victoria's diamond-encrusted smartwatch. It was the distinct alert tone she specifically reserved for high-priority corporate communications. Instinctively, she glanced down at her wrist. The blood instantly drained from her perfectly bronzed face, leaving her looking like a beautifully dressed corpse. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She read the notification again, her eyes wide with mounting terror. She scrambled to grab her phone from the table to open the full message, her manicured fingers slipping frantically against the glass screen. "What is it now?" My father barked, his patience completely obliterated by the relentless string of disasters. "Victoria, speak. Tell us what is happening." "It is an urgent directive from the holding company," Victoria whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of her own panicked breathing. "The majority shareholder. They are invoking the Emergency Operational Takeover Clause. They have demanded a mandatory board of directors meeting at exactly 8 o'clock tomorrow morning." She looked up, her eyes locking onto mine with a mixture of dawning horror and absolute dread, as she read the final line of the email out loud to the dead silent room. "The meeting is called to execute the immediate termination of the Chief Executive Officer and the Chief Financial Officer effective immediately without severance." The dawn brought no relief to the executives of Apex Innovations. By 6 in the morning, the corporate suite was a war zone. The sleek, minimalist aesthetic of the glass-walled office was completely shattered by the frantic energy radiating from Marcus and Victoria. Marcus was pacing the length of his office like a caged animal, his custom-tailored tie ripped away, his shirt unbuttoned at the collar, and his skin slick with a cold, terrified sweat. Victoria was hunched over the massive mahogany conference table, her manicured fingers flying across her laptop keyboard. She was running the financial diagnostics again and again, refusing to accept the catastrophic reality displayed on the glowing screen. "It is gone!" Victoria gasped, her voice cracking as she stared at the digital ledger. "Marcus, $560 million is gone." "Do not say that out loud," Marcus barked, spinning around to glare at her. "It is not gone. It cannot just vanish. The holding company must have placed a temporary freeze on the operational capital. They are trying to squeeze us out before the morning meeting." "It is not a freeze!" Victoria yelled, slamming her hands flat against the table. "I am looking at the routing trace. The debt covenant was triggered at midnight. Every single dollar of our operational funds, our reserves, our offshore holdings, all of it was legally siphoned to cover the manufactured vendor liabilities. The proxy firm liquidated us. We have exactly zero liquidity." When the board walks into this room at 8, we are finished. They are going to audit the books, see the massive deficit, and have us escorted out by security. We could face criminal charges for gross negligence. Marcus grabbed his hair, tugging at the roots as his breathing turned shallow and rapid. He needed a patch. He needed a massive immediate injection of capital to falsify the morning report to show the anonymous majority shareholder that Apex still held operational viability. If he could just stall the audit, he could figure a way out of the trap. "Get Brad on the phone!" Marcus ordered, his eyes darting frantically toward the wall clock. It was 7:15. "We need the Carter family investment. We need that $5 million transferred right now." Across the city, in the opulent study of the Carter estate, my father was already awake. Brad had arrived at dawn, carrying the finalized investment paperwork in a leather briefcase. The atmosphere in my father's study was practically giddy. They had completely dismissed the humiliating events of the previous night as a temporary banking error easily explained away by Marcus's smooth assurances. When Brad's phone rang with an urgent call from Marcus, the room fell silent. Brad listened for a moment, his chest puffing out with self-importance before putting the call on speaker. Desmond, Marcus said, his voice stripped of its usual calm, replaced by a manufactured urgent excitement. "The holding company is attempting a hostile takeover this morning. They want to dilute your preferred equity stake before the markets open. If we do not counter their move with your capital immediately, you will lose the buy-in window. We need the wire transfer authorized right this second." My father did not hesitate. Blinded by greed and his absolute worship of Marcus's corporate status, he eagerly pulled his laptop closer. Vivian stood behind him, resting her hands on his shoulders, practically vibrating with excitement. "Do not worry, Marcus," my father said, his voice booming with arrogant pride. "We are authorizing the release right now. I am liquidating the core retirement portfolios and bypassing the standard hold periods. The Carter Trust stands with you." Brad leaned over the desk, pointing to the transfer authorization screen. "This is how real players operate," Brad boasted, completely oblivious to the fact that he was helping my parents throw their life savings into a roaring incinerator. "We are locking in a global empire." My father entered his security codes and clicked the final authorization button. The banking portal displayed a spinning loading icon processing the irrevocable transfer of $5 million. While they waited for the confirmation, my mother pulled her cell phone from the pocket of her silk morning robe, her face twisted into a sharp, vindictive sneer. She simply could not resist the urge to twist the knife to punish me for my absolute lack of compliance at the dinner table. She dialed my number, putting her phone on speaker so my father and Brad could hear. I was sitting by the floor-to-ceiling windows of my actual penthouse, sipping a freshly brewed espresso when the call came through. I answered without a word, staring out over the waking city. "Zuri." My mother spat, her voice dripping with toxic superiority. "I am calling to tell you that your pathetic little stunt last night failed miserably. You tried to embarrass this family, but you only proved exactly why Marcus had to leave you. You are a bitter, jealous failure. You have absolutely no idea how the real world works." I took a slow sip of my coffee, feeling the warm ceramic against my palms. I did not interrupt her tirade. I simply let her dig the grave deeper. "Your father and Brad are finalizing the $5 million wire transfer to Apex right now," she bragged loudly, her voice echoing in my father's study. "We are securing our wealth, while you will probably spend the rest of your life struggling to pay rent. You drove a brilliant man away because of your massive insecurities. You are a disgrace to the Carter name. Do not ever show your face at our home again." My mother waited for me to cry, to yell, to beg for forgiveness. She thrived on drawing emotional blood. "Are you quite finished, Vivian?" I asked, my voice as cold and flat as a sheet of ice. My mother gasped in sheer outrage at my use of her first name. "How dare you!" "Thank you for confirming the transfer," I said smoothly, setting my coffee cup down on the glass table. "Have a wonderful Monday." I hung up the phone before she could scream another word. Back in the Apex executive suite, the tension was suffocating. Victoria was staring at the digital banking portal, her hands gripping the edge of the mahogany table so hard her knuckles were white. The clock on the wall ticked forward. 7:58, 7:59. Then a sharp, crisp digital chime echoed from the computer speakers. Victoria let out a massive, shuddering breath. It cleared, she gasped. Dropping into a heavy leather desk chair, the Carter $5 million just hit the primary operational account. "It is there," We have liquidity. We can patch the deficit report before the board walks in. Marcus sagged against the glass wall, closing his eyes in absolute relief. He wiped the cold sweat from his forehead with the back of his sleeve. He had done it. He had successfully robbed his ex-wife's family to save his own skin. He truly believed he had survived the storm. The heavy digital clock on the wall clicked over to exactly 8 o'clock in the morning. Instantly, the massive frosted glass doors of the Apex corporate boardroom burst wide open. The frosted glass parted with a heavy, pressurized hiss, revealing the inner sanctum of the Apex corporate boardroom. I stepped across the threshold, the sharp, rhythmic strike of my stilettos hitting the polished concrete floor like the ticking of a bomb. I was no longer wearing the understated silk I had worn to my parents' dinner. I was draped in a razor-sharp, custom-tailored midnight blue power suit that radiated absolute authority. My spine was perfectly straight, my chin held high, and my eyes were locked dead ahead with the cold, unyielding precision of an apex predator. Behind me moved a wall of undeniable legal power. Four of the most ruthless, highly compensated corporate litigators in Atlanta flanked me, walking in perfect, intimidating synchronization. Leading them was Harrison, a silver-haired shark of a lawyer whose mere presence in a boardroom usually signaled the end of someone's career. They carried heavy leather briefcases and thick stacks of bound documents, moving with the quiet confidence of people who already knew they had won the war. Inside the boardroom, the scene was a masterpiece of misplaced arrogance. Marcus and Victoria stood near the head of the massive glass table, their faces flushed with the adrenaline of their supposed survival. Seated along the right side were my parents, Desmond and Vivian, accompanied by Chloe and Brad. They had rushed over to the corporate headquarters to witness the morning meeting, eager to bask in the glory of their new $5 million investment and shake hands with the anonymous majority shareholder who controlled their destiny. When they saw me walk through those doors, the arrogant smiles melted off their faces, replaced by profound, utter confusion. For a split second, the room was trapped in absolute silence. Then Victoria's face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. She slammed her hands down on the glass table, her voice reaching a shrill, hysterical pitch. "What the hell is this?" Victoria screamed, her eyes darting frantically from me to the lawyers. "Security! How did she get past the front desk? Who let this woman up to the executive floor?" My mother shot up from her leather chair, her face burning with secondary embarrassment. "Zuri, have you completely lost your mind?" she demanded, treating me like a disobedient toddler throwing a tantrum. "This is a closed corporate meeting for board members and major investors. You have absolutely no right to be here. Get out of this room before I have Brad physically throw you out." Brad puffed out his chest, stepping away from the table as if preparing to actually lay hands on me. "You heard your mother," Zuri, Brad barked, trying to inject some deep masculine authority into his voice. "The adults are doing business. Take your little temper tantrum back to your cheap apartment before we call the police for trespassing." I did not break my stride. I did not blink. I walked directly past Brad, ignoring his existence entirely, and moved straight toward the head of the boardroom table. Marcus was standing there, frozen, his eyes wide and glassy. He was looking at the four elite lawyers surrounding me, and the horrible, crushing realization was just beginning to claw its way up his throat. Victoria lunged forward, her face contorted with rage, ready to physically block me from taking the seat at the head of the table. "I demand you leave my boardroom this instant," she shrieked. Before she could take another step, Harrison moved. He stepped seamlessly between Victoria and me. With a fluid practice motion, he raised a massive 2-inch thick binder of legal documents and brought it down flat against the center of the glass table. The impact sounded like a gunshot. The entire room flinched. "I strongly advise you to carefully regulate your tone and your volume," Victoria Harrison said. His voice was not loud, but it carried a lethal, icy weight that instantly suffocated her screaming. "You are currently raising your voice at the wrong person." Victoria blinked, taking a stumbling step backward. "What are you talking about? I am the chief executive officer of this company." Harrison offered a smile completely devoid of warmth. "You are an employee," he corrected her sharply. "And right now, you are screaming at the person who signs your paychecks." Allow me to formally introduce the founder of the holding company that entirely financed your expansion. You are standing in the presence of the absolute owner of 80% of Apex Innovations, Ms. Zuri Carter. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating silence that occurs right after a fatal car crash when the shock is too massive for the human brain to process. Victoria's mouth opened, but her vocal cords refused to work. She stared at the thick legal binder on the table, her eyes tracking my name printed in bold letters across the front cover as the majority shareholder. Her perfectly manicured hands began to tremble so violently she had to grab the back of her chair just to remain standing. My father Desmond stood frozen by his seat. The color drained from his face in a rapid, horrifying wave. He looked from me to the legal documents and then down to his own phone, where the confirmation of his $5 million wire transfer was still glowing on the screen. The money he thought he was investing to secure a piece of a global empire had been wired directly into a corporate structure that I entirely owned. He had just handed me his retirement fund. Vivienne let out a faint, strangled gasp, sinking slowly back down into her chair, as if her legs could no longer support her weight. The reality of her actions, the insults, the mockery, the phone call she had made just an hour ago bragging about her wealth was crashing down on her all at once. She was staring at a billionaire, and she had just told that billionaire to never show her face at the family home again. But it was Marcus who finally broke. He looked at me standing tall and untouchable at the head of the table, flanked by lawyers who could dismantle his life with a single signature. He realized that every single thing he thought he owned, the penthouse, the cars, the company, the prestige, belonged entirely to me. He had spent the last 2 years running on a treadmill that I had built, powered by electricity that I paid for. His knees simply gave out. Marcus collapsed backward, hitting his ergonomic leather chair with a heavy thud. He slumped forward, his hands gripping the armrests as he stared blankly at the floor. He was completely broken. I stepped up to the edge of the table, resting my hands lightly on the cool glass. I looked around the room, making deliberate, unhurried eye contact with the people who had spent my entire life trying to make me feel small. "Good morning, everyone," I said, my voice cutting through the dead air with absolute clarity. "The board meeting will now come to order." I took my seat slowly, the leather chair sighing under the weight of the moment. Harrison stood at my right, opening his briefcase with a sharp metallic click that echoed like a guillotine dropping. He pulled out a sleek silver tablet and connected it to the boardroom's central console. The massive floor-to-ceiling interactive glass wall behind me instantly darkened, transforming into a state-of-the-art presentation screen. The room was so quiet I could hear the erratic, shallow breathing of the people sitting across from me. I leaned forward, folding my hands perfectly together on the glass surface. For the past 12 months, I began my voice perfectly level and entirely devoid of sympathy. My holding company has conducted a rigorous covert forensic audit of Apex Innovations. We monitored every transaction, traced every offshore routing number, and decrypted every hidden ledger. What we found was not just gross incompetence, it was spectacular, unmitigated fraud. I nodded to Harrison. He tapped the screen. A high-definition spreadsheet illuminated the dark room, casting a harsh, unforgiving blue light over Marcus and Victoria's terrified faces. The data was impossible to misinterpret. Side-by-side comparisons filled the screen, matching fabricated corporate expenses with deeply personal, highly extravagant purchases. Every stolen dollar was tracked, highlighted in a glowing crimson font that practically bled across the display. "Let us start with the chief financial officer," I said, shifting my gaze to Victoria. She shrank back into her chair, as if trying to physically disappear into the upholstery. "That is a truly stunning, radiant cut diamond on your left hand, Victoria. A flawless 5-carat stone." Victoria instinctively yanked her left hand off the table, hiding it in her lap like a guilty child. According to the internal Apex ledgers, I continued, my eyes tracking her every flinch. That ring was categorized as a Tier 1 server infrastructure upgrade, a $250,000 piece of jewelry purchased with operational capital disguised as a tech expenditure, and that is just the beginning. Harrison tapped the tablet again. A cascade of luxury receipts flooded the screen, scrolling at a dizzying pace. Private jet charters to St. Bart's, billed as client acquisition trips. I read aloud, watching Marcus wipe another layer of cold sweat from his pale forehead. $300,000 to completely erase Victoria's personal credit card debt routed through a shell vendor account in the Cayman Islands. $700,000 in luxury vehicle leases. You treated this company like your personal piggy bank, Marcus. You drained the lifeblood out of Apex to fund a billionaire lifestyle you never actually earned. It was an accounting error, Marcus stammered, his voice cracking pitifully. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. Zuri, listen to me. The CFO firm we hired, they mismanaged the categorizations. We can fix the books. We can restate the earnings. We just need a little time. Harrison let out a dry, humorless chuckle. Mr. Sterling. Harrison interjected, his voice carrying the lethal weight of a seasoned prosecutor. We have your digital signatures on every single one of the fraudulent wire transfers. We have the IP addresses. We have the encrypted emails where you explicitly instructed Ms. Vance to alter the balance sheets. You are not facing an accounting error. You are facing 20 years in federal prison for corporate embezzlement and wire fraud. The words federal prison hung in the air like a death sentence. Victoria let out a sharp, hysterical sob, burying her face in her hands. Her perfectly constructed reality was burning to the ground, and the smoke was choking her. My gaze slowly drifted down the side of the table, taking in the absolute devastation of my own family. The atmosphere was incredibly suffocating, thick with the undeniable stench of ruin. My mother, Vivian, was completely paralyzed. Her mouth was slightly open, her eyes wide and glassy, staring at the screen that outlined the undeniable criminality of the man she had worshipped. The man she had constantly compared me to. The man she had deemed superior in every possible way. My father, Desmond, looked physically ill. The arrogant patriarch who had spent his entire life dominating every room he walked into was now hyperventilating. He clutched his chest as the monumental scale of his catastrophic mistake began to settle into his bones. His perfectly tailored suit suddenly looked 2 sizes too big for his deflating frame. I watched them closely, feeling absolutely nothing. No pity, no vindication. Just the cold, sterile satisfaction of watching gravity finally do its job. They had placed all their faith, all their loyalty, and all their money into a hollow shell, and now they were watching it crush them. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by a violent commotion at the far end of the table. Brad leapt to his feet, his heavy chair crashing backward onto the marble floor. His face was a dangerously deep shade of purple, the veins in his neck bulging against his tight collar. The realization had finally pierced through his thick skull. "Wait!" Brad roared, slamming his fists down on the glass, his eyes darting frantically from the damning audit on the screen to my father's equally horrified face. The audit. The deficit. If the company was completely drained of funds before this morning. He stopped, his chest heaving as the horrifying math finally clicked into place. "What about the $5 million? Brad screamed, his voice echoing violently off the glass walls. He pointed a trembling, enraged finger directly at me. "The Carter Trust, my family's money. We just wired $5 million into the Apex operational account to cover the deficit. If you own the holding company, and you own the debt." Brad's voice broke into a desperate, panicked shriek. "Give it back. Reverse the wire right now. That is our money." I slowly leaned back in my executive leather chair. I looked at Brad, then at my father, and finally at my mother. I let a slow, chilling smile spread across my face. The slow, chilling smile that spread across my face was the only answer Brad received. The imaginary camera of the room's attention tracked my every movement as I held his frantic, bloodshot gaze for 3 excruciating seconds, letting the absolute silence of the boardroom amplify his panic. Then I turned my attention to the massive digital display glowing behind me. I raised my hand and pointed a single perfectly manicured finger at the screen. "That is exactly why I wished you luck executing your new contract last night, Brad," I said, my voice smooth and carrying the lethal precision of a striking blade. I began to walk, pacing slowly down the side of the long glass table. You see, when you and my father were blindly rushing to throw $5 million at what you thought was a golden opportunity, you failed to do the one thing every first-year business student knows to do. You failed to read the fine print. I nodded to Harrison. The silver-haired lawyer tapped his tablet. The digital display instantly shifted. The cascading receipts of Victoria and Marcus's embezzlement vanished, replaced by a high-resolution scan of the exact legal document my father and Brad had signed mere hours ago. Key sections of the text were highlighted in bright, glaring yellow. I stopped pacing, standing directly behind Marcus. He flinched, shrinking into his leather chair as if my proximity caused him physical pain. I rested my hands lightly on the back of his seat and leaned forward. Section 4. Paragraph 12 of the Emergency Equity Injection Agreement. I recited from memory, my words cutting through the sterile air of the boardroom. It clearly stipulates that any new capital deposited into the Apex operational accounts during an active internal audit is immediately classified as a debt remediation asset. The funds do not purchase equity, Brad. They purchase indemnity. Brad stared at the screen, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. He blinked rapidly, desperately, trying to comprehend the dense legal jargon glaring down at him. What are you saying? He choked out, his voice trembling with a mixture of raw rage and profound panic. I am saying the money is gone, Brad, I replied, offering him a look of manufactured sympathy. According to the embedded clause, you were entirely too arrogant to review your $5 million, was automatically seized the exact second it hit the corporate ledger this morning. It was applied directly to offset the massive embezzlement debt Marcus and Victoria owe to my holding company. I paused, letting the crushing reality sink deep into his bones. I looked at his pale, sweating face, and then down at my father, who was gripping his chest. Thank you, Brad. Thank you, Father. You just graciously paid off my ex-husband's criminal restitution out of your own pockets. The sound that tore from my father's throat was not a word. It was a hollow, agonizing wheeze. Desmond Carter, the man who had spent his entire life building his wealth, the man who had continuously lectured me on my absolute worthlessness, slumped sideways in his chair. His perfectly tailored suit suddenly looked 2 sizes too big for his deflating frame. The immense, monumental scale of his catastrophic mistake had finally shattered his arrogant pride. Vivian let out a piercing, hysterical shriek. She grabbed his arm, her carefully maintained facade of high society elegance shattering into a million pieces. We are ruined. My mother wailed, her voice echoing shrilly off the glass walls. Desmond, do something right now. Call the bank. Stop the wire transfer. Tell them it was fraud. It is completely irrevocable, Harrison stated coldly, not even bothering to look in her direction as he adjusted his glasses. The transaction has fully cleared the Federal Reserve. The funds have already been absorbed and redistributed across the holding company's asset portfolio. You have effectively donated your life savings to cover corporate fraud. Legally, there is absolutely nothing you can do. Victoria was hyperventilating loudly. She pushed her chair back, the wheels squeaking aggressively against the floor, desperately trying to put distance between herself and the table. She looked at Marcus, her eyes wide with a feral, cornered terror. You told me it was a standard capital call, she screamed at him, her voice cracking. You said the Carter money would clear the operational deficit, and we would hide the rest before the board noticed. You set me up. You used me to take the fall. Marcus finally lifted his head. His face was a sickly pale gray, glistening with a cold, clammy sweat. He looked around the room, his eyes darting from the unyielding faces of my legal team to the locked glass doors. He realized that every single exit was sealed, every asset was frozen, and his entire life was completely over. He looked up at Brad, holding up his hands in a pathetic, trembling gesture of surrender. Brad, listen to me, Marcus pleaded, his voice breaking into a desperate whine. We can fix this. I know people in private equity. I can secure a secondary loan. I just need you to stay calm and let me make a few phone calls. We can get the money back. Brad did not stay calm. The transformation was instantaneous and utterly terrifying. The realization that he had just signed away $5 million, his corporate bonuses, his liquid savings, his entire future because of Marcus's lies, snapped whatever thin thread of sanity he had left. A guttural, animalistic roar tore from Brad's throat, vibrating through the boardroom. He launched himself across the mahogany and glass table. Crystal water pitchers and ceramic coffee mugs shattered as Brad's heavy boots kicked them aside. He scrambled over the polished surface like a madman, his eyes wild bloodshot and completely devoid of reason. Marcus screamed, scrambling backward in his wheeled chair, but he was far too slow. Brad threw himself off the edge of the table and tackled Marcus to the floor with a bone-crunching thud. My mother screamed again, a raw sound of sheer terror scrambling out of her chair and pressing herself flat against the glass wall. Victoria shrieked, covering her head with her arms and diving under the far end of the conference table. Brad straddled Marcus's chest, his thick, heavy hands shooting out and clamping directly around Marcus's throat. "Give me my money back!" Brad roared, his face turning a dangerous explosive shade of crimson. "Give me my money, you pathetic lying thief!" Marcus thrashed wildly, his expensive suit tearing against the rough carpet. His hands clawed desperately at Brad's thick wrists, his face turning a mottled purple as his oxygen supply was violently cut off. He gagged, his eyes bulging in pure panic, desperately trying to pry Brad's unforgiving fingers apart. But Brad was fueled by pure, unadulterated rage. He slammed Marcus's head back against the concrete floor, ignoring the sickening thud that echoed through the room. I stood perfectly still at the head of the table, watching the two men who had spent years mocking my intelligence violently destroy each other on the floor of my boardroom. I did not ask my security team to intervene. I did not ask Harrison or the other lawyers to call them off. I simply watched, my arms casually crossed over my chest, feeling a deep, profound sense of absolute closure. The high society elite, the untouchable corporate titans, were now reduced to brawling like wild animals over the money they had willingly handed over to the woman they deemed a complete failure. Suddenly, a new sound pierced through the chaotic, violent screaming inside the boardroom. It started as a faint wail in the distance, a sharp contrast to the sounds of breaking glass and choking gasps. It quickly rose in pitch and volume until it echoed through the thick floor-to-ceiling glass windows of the executive suite. Red and blue lights began to flash against the surrounding skyscrapers, casting an eerie, frantic glow into the darkened room. The wailing sound multiplied, tearing through the quiet morning air with an undeniable urgency. Police sirens, dozens of them, and they were converging directly in front of the Apex headquarters lobby downstairs. The heavy oak doors of the boardroom did not simply open, they violently burst apart. A swarm of tactical officers and federal agents flooded into the room, their dark uniforms and tactical gear creating a jarring contrast against the sleek, modern aesthetic of the executive suite. Hands in the air, step away from each other, the lead agent barked, his voice cutting through the chaos with absolute authority. Two large officers immediately lunged forward, grabbing Brad by the shoulders and forcefully hauling him off Marcus. Brad thrashed for a moment before realizing who had him restrained, finally slumping against the far wall, panting heavily. Marcus remained on the floor, gasping for air and coughing violently into the plush carpet. While the officers secured the perimeter, two federal agents flanked the conference table and dragged Victoria out from underneath it. She kicked and screamed, her expensive silk skirt riding up awkwardly as she fought against their grip. "You cannot do this!" Victoria shrieked, her perfectly styled hair falling in messy strands across her face. "I am the chief executive officer of this company. I demand to call my lawyers." The lead investigator stepped forward, holding a thick folder of warrants. "Victoria Vance," he announced, his voice devoid of any emotion, "you are under arrest for corporate embezzlement, wire fraud, and grand larceny." The metallic snap of the handcuffs closing tightly around her wrists sounded like absolute music to my ears. Victoria froze, the reality of the cold steel against her skin finally breaking through her hysteria. She locked eyes with me, her mascara running down her cheeks in thick, dark streaks, completely ruining her flawless facade. I simply stood there, my hands resting lightly on the table, and offered her a slow, deliberate smile. Then a pathetic sound drew my attention to the floor. Marcus had managed to push himself up. His face was bruised and bleeding from Brad's fists, his custom-tailored suit ripped at the collar. He looked at Victoria being hauled toward the door in handcuffs, and the full crushing scope of his reality finally sank in. He was entirely trapped. His stolen empire was gone. His freedom was over. Marcus turned his head and looked at me. Desperation pure and primal washed over his features. He did not try to stand. Instead, he crawled. He crawled across the shattered glass of the water pitchers, ignoring the sharp shards cutting into his palms and knees, dragging himself directly to where I stood at the head of the table. He threw his arms around my legs, burying his weeping, bloodied face against my knees. He sobbed uncontrollably, his entire body shaking with violent, pathetic tremors. "Zuri, please," he wailed, his voice cracking into a high-pitched plea. "You have to listen to me." It was her. Victoria set me up. She manipulated the ledgers. She seduced me into signing those wire transfers. I swear I never wanted to hurt you. I always loved you, Zuri. Please do not let them take me away. I will do anything you want. I looked down at the man who had completely shattered my heart. The man who had stolen my confidence and tossed me aside for a cheaper, flashier version of success. For a brief, singular second, my vision blurred. A single tear escaped, sliding slowly down my cheek. But it was not a tear of sorrow. It was not a tear of regret. And it was certainly not a tear of residual love. It was the physical manifestation of pure, unconditional release. The heavy, suffocating chain I had carried around my neck for years was finally snapping. I was entirely free. I reached down and grabbed him by the chin, my fingers digging painfully into his jaw, forcing his tear-stained face up to look at me. I stepped back, ripping my legs out of his desperate grip. "Do not insult my intelligence," I said, my voice echoing through the silent room with an icy, unforgiving detachment. "The diamond ring you gave her was bought with my money. The private jets, the cars, the penthouse, it was all funded by my capital. You have absolutely nothing. You are just a beggar in a suit." I looked up and signaled the waiting agents. They stepped forward instantly, grabbing Marcus by his armpits and hoisting him roughly to his feet. He thrashed wildly, his expensive shoes slipping on the wet floor. "Zuri," he screamed, his voice tearing at his throat. "Zuri, please." I turned my back on him. I listened to his desperate screams fade down the executive hallway as the agents dragged him toward the elevators, his cries abruptly silenced as the heavy boardroom doors swung shut. The silence that settled over the room was heavy and absolute. The police were gone, taking the trash with them. Harrison and my legal team calmly began packing their documents into their briefcases. The business of the morning officially concluded. But the show was not entirely over. My family was still there. Brad was sitting in the corner, clutching his bruised knuckles and staring blankly at the floor. My father Desmond stood frozen near his chair, while my mother Vivian clutched his arm for support. The sheer terror of losing $5 million was written clearly across their aging faces. Slowly, Desmond straightened his ruined jacket. He cleared his throat, forcing his shoulders back in a pathetic attempt to regain his usual patriarchal authority. He took a hesitant step toward me. The mask of arrogance he had worn my entire life melted away, rapidly replaced by a deeply unsettling, highly artificial affection. He reached out his hands toward me, completely ignoring the fact that I had just orchestrated the total destruction of his retirement fund. "Zuri, sweetheart," my father cooed, his voice trembling with a forced, sickeningly sweet warmth. That was an incredibly stressful situation. "But we are family. We are your blood. Now that those horrible people are gone, we really need to sit down and talk about reversing that wire transfer. You know we love you, and family always takes care of family." The air in the room grew thick, almost toxic, with the sheer weight of my father's delusion. I stared at him, observing the desperate, sweating man who had just invoked the word family after spending 3 decades making sure I felt entirely excluded from it. I tilted my head, studying him like a biological specimen under a microscope. My eyes shifted past his trembling shoulders, the focus of my vision smoothly transitioning to my mother. Vivian was clutching her pearl necklace so tightly the string looked ready to snap. Her face was a canvas of pure, unadulterated terror. "You leveraged the house," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, yet it carried across the shattered glass and ruined boardroom with razor-sharp clarity. Vivian let out a strangled gasp, pushing past my father. Her pristine high society composure was completely gone, replaced by the frantic, clawing desperation of a woman watching her kingdom burn. "Zuri, you have to reverse the transaction," she shrieked, her voice cracking painfully. "That $5 million was our entire retirement fund. We mortgaged the Buckhead mansion to secure that cash. You cannot be this ruthless. You cannot do this to your own mother. You cannot leave us destitute over a business misunderstanding." "A business misunderstanding?" I repeated, testing the absolute absurdity of the phrase on my tongue. "You mortgaged the family estate to buy equity in a stolen company, bypassing all legal due diligence because you were blinded by greed. And now you expect me to refund your catastrophic stupidity." I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I simply turned to my right and gave Harrison a single subtle nod. The seasoned attorney did not miss a beat. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a fresh, heavily bound stack of legal documents. He tossed them onto the table. They slid across the smooth glass, coming to a dead stop exactly 1 inch from my father's trembling fingertips. "You see, Mother," I continued, my gaze locking onto Vivian's panicked eyes with absolute glacial indifference. "Wealth is not just about having money. It is about understanding how money moves." When I saw the massive wire transfer hit the Apex operational account this morning, I did not just freeze the funds. I traced the origination point. I traced it all the way back to the secondary lending institution that issued your high-risk mortgage. Desmond looked down at the thick stack of papers. The bold black letters on the cover page seemed to physically strike him. He stumbled backward, knocking into the edge of his overturned leather chair. Harrison stepped forward, adjusting his suit jacket with mechanical precision. "Mr. and Mrs. Carter," he announced, his voice devoid of any human sympathy. "6 weeks ago, your primary lender classified the mortgage on your Buckhead estate as a distressed asset due to consecutive missed payments. They bundled that debt and sold it on the secondary market." Vivian shook her head frantically. "No," she gasped, pointing a shaking finger at Harrison. "We had an arrangement with the bank. We just needed the Apex dividends to cover the arrears." "You do not have an arrangement anymore," I stated, stepping away from the head of the table and walking slowly toward them. "Because your bank sold that defaulted mortgage to Vanguard Asset Management. And I am the sole proprietor of Vanguard." The absolute silence that followed was deafening. My parents were completely paralyzed. The realization hit them with the force of a freight train. They had not just lost their $5 million investment. They had handed their ancestral home, the very symbol of their elite social status, directly to the daughter they had always treated like dirt. "I own your debt," I said, stopping just a few feet away from my mother. "I own the mortgage. I own the title. I own the roof over your head. And because you are severely delinquent on your payments, and because you just drained your entire liquid cash reserve into my holding company to cover Marcus's fraud, I exercised my legal right as the primary lien holder." Desmond opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. He just stared at me, his eyes wide and vacant, completely broken. At exactly 3 o'clock this afternoon, I continued checking the diamond watch on my wrist. A team of federal marshals will arrive at the Buckhead estate. They will post a formal notice of immediate eviction on the front gates. The locks have already been electronically changed. The security system has been overridden. You have absolutely no legal right to step foot on that property ever again." Vivienne simply collapsed. Her legs gave out completely, and she dropped to her knees on the marble floor, her expensive designer dress pooling around her. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders heaving with loud, uncontrollable sobs. My father did not try to help her up. He just stood there staring blankly at the wall, a hollow shell of the man he used to be. "You have no home to return to," I stated coldly, looking down at my weeping mother. "You are officially trespassing if you try." Suddenly, a sharp, panicked gasp broke from the far corner of the room. Chloe, the golden child, the perfect, beautiful daughter who had spent her entire life basking in the glow of our parents' wealth and privilege, finally understood the magnitude of the situation. Her safety net was entirely gone. Her endless trust fund was zeroed out. The family empire she relied on to fund her lavish lifestyle had simply ceased to exist. Chloe's eyes darted frantically around the ruined boardroom. She backed away from our crying mother and our paralyzed father. Her chest heaved with rapid, terrified breaths. Desperate for a lifeline, she spun around and lunged toward Brad. She grabbed his arm, her manicured nails digging into his torn, blood-stained suit jacket, clinging to her husband like a drowning woman desperately searching for a piece of floating wreckage. "Get your filthy hands off me!" Brad snarled, his voice a venomous hiss that cut through the sound of my mother's weeping. He violently jerked his arm away, shoving Chloe backward with such aggressive force that she stumbled on her high heels and crashed into the edge of a heavy leather chair. She gasped, her perfectly manicured hands flying up to her face in utter shock. The loving, devoted husband she had proudly paraded around every country club and high society gala in Atlanta was completely gone. In his place stood a cornered, desperate animal. Brad wiped a smear of Marcus's blood off his cheek, his chest heaving as he glared at my sister with pure, unadulterated disgust. "Do not touch me, Chloe!" Brad roared. His face contorted into a mask of absolute rage. "Do you have any idea what your idiot father just did? Do you have any comprehension of the catastrophic mess your family just dragged me into? That $5 million was not just my liquid savings and corporate bonuses. I leveraged capital from my firm. I quietly diverted funds from two of my largest wealth management clients to make that bridge loan happen. I needed that cash back by Friday to balance the escrow accounts." Chloe stared at him, her mouth trembling, her eyes wide with terror as the horrific truth finally registered. "You stole client money?" she whispered, her voice breaking into a terrified squeak. "Brad, you committed fraud." "I did what I had to do to maintain the lifestyle you constantly demand," Brad screamed, spit flying from his lips. "And now the money is gone, absorbed by your psychotic sister. I am going to be investigated by the Securities and Exchange Commission. I am going to be disbarred. I am going to federal prison because I trusted a family of incompetent, pathetic frauds." Brad spun around, his wild, bloodshot eyes sweeping over my father, my mother, and finally settling back on Chloe. The thin, polished veneer of the progressive, wealthy executive completely evaporated, revealing the ugly, deep-seated bigotry he had clearly been harboring for years. "I should have listened to my father." Brad spat, his voice dropping into a sneering, deeply hateful tone. "He warned me about marrying into your kind of family. He told me that no matter how much money you made, no matter how many exclusive zip codes you moved into, you would always just be street trash playing dress-up in our world." Desmond's head snapped up, his eyes widening in shock at the blatant, undisguised racism spewing from his golden son-in-law's mouth. Brad Desmond warned, his voice shaky, but attempting to find some residual authority. "Watch your mouth. You are speaking to my daughter." "You do not have a daughter," Brad fired back, taking a threatening step toward my father. "You have a pair of useless, spoiled parasites, and you are a bankrupt, pathetic old man who just lost his entire empire because he was too stupid to read a contract. You people are a joke. You thought buying a mansion in Buckhead made you equal to us. You thought wearing European suits and joining our golf clubs erased what you actually are. But the second the pressure was applied, you showed your true colors. You are nothing but an affirmative action diversity quota that got lucky, and now you are returning right back to the gutter where you belong." Vivian let out a loud, horrified gasp, covering her mouth with her hands. The absolute degradation of her family coming from the mouth of the white aristocratic son-in-law she had practically worshipped was the final fatal blow to her fabricated reality. "I am done," Brad declared, adjusting his torn suit jacket with trembling, frantic hands. "I am calling my attorneys the second I step out of this building. I am filing for divorce before the ink even dries on your eviction notice, Chloe. I am legally severing myself from this pathetic circus. I will liquidate my personal assets. I will testify against your father to save my own skin, and I will erase the Carter name from my life permanently. Do not call me. Do not come to the house. You are dead to me." Chloe's knees simply gave out. She collapsed onto the marble floor, her expensive designer dress pooling around her as she broke into loud, hysterical sobs. She reached out a trembling hand toward Brad, begging him to stay, pleading with him not to abandon her, but he just sneered down at her with a look of absolute revulsion. The picture-perfect Carter family was entirely destroyed. They were completely stripped of their wealth, their status, their dignity, and their fraudulent unity. They were reduced to weeping broken shells, viciously tearing each other apart on the floor of my boardroom. I watched the pathetic scene unfold with a calm, steady heartbeat. The satisfaction was absolute, a cold surgical precision that left no room for pity. I slowly pushed myself away from the head of the conference table. The sharp, rhythmic strike of my stilettos echoed like a ticking clock as I walked past my sobbing mother and my paralyzed father. I did not spare them a single glance. I stopped directly in front of Brad. He flinched, instinctively pulling his shoulders back as if anticipating a physical blow. The aggressive racist tyrant who had just spent 2 minutes tearing my family apart suddenly looked incredibly small. His chest heaved, his knuckles were bruised, and a thin sheen of nervous sweat coated his forehead. He stared at me with wide, panicked eyes, completely expecting me to scream to defend my parents, or perhaps to beg him to spare Chloe the humiliation of a public divorce. I did none of those things. I simply observed him with the same detached fascination one might use to study an insect trapped in a jar. "You talk a big game about pedigrees and bloodlines, Brad," I said, my voice smooth and dangerously low, slicing through the heavy air of the room. "You stand there in your custom Italian suit and preach about the untouchable superiority of your world. But look at you now. You are just a pathetic, cornered thief who stole from his own clients because he was too incompetent to manage his own greed. The Securities and Exchange Commission does not care about your country club memberships. Federal prison does not care about your family name. You are going to lose everything, and you did it to yourself." Brad opened his mouth to respond, to throw another insult, or desperately try to justify his fraud, but the words died in his throat. He looked at my unyielding expression and realized that absolutely nothing he said mattered. I held all the cards, I held all the power, and I possessed absolutely zero mercy. I turned away from him, letting my gaze sweep over the absolute wreckage of the Carter family. Chloe was still curled on the floor, hyperventilating, her tear-streaked face buried in her hands. Desmond remained frozen against the wall, a hollow, defeated shell of a man who had just lost his entire identity. And Vivian, my mother, was staring at me with a look of pure, unadulterated horror. Slowly and deliberately, I reached into the inner breast pocket of my tailored vest. The room fell dead silent, the only sound the ragged breathing of my broken relatives. My fingers traced the crisp, sharp edge of a piece of paper I had prepared earlier this morning. I pulled it out, holding it casually between my index and middle fingers. It was a certified cashier's check. I extended my arm over the polished mahogany surface of the conference table. I looked directly at my parents, holding their terrified gazes for a long, agonizing second. Then I opened my fingers. The check fluttered downward in a slow, graceful descent. It landed perfectly in the center of the table, resting right beside a shattered crystal water glass. The stark black ink printed across the front of the paper was clearly visible. It was made out for exactly $1,000. "Take that," I said, my voice echoing with icy finality. "Use it to rent a cheap apartment somewhere on the outskirts of the city. It might cover your first month's deposit in a neighborhood you previously pretended did not exist. Consider it a parting gift from the daughter you called a failure." For a moment, nobody moved. The sheer calculated insult of a $1,000 check offered to people who had just lost an estate worth tens of millions hung in the air like a physical strike. Then Vivian snapped. The remaining shreds of her high society elegance vanished entirely. She scrambled up from her knees, her face red and contorted with a primal, desperate rage. She rushed toward the table, her hands gripping the edge of the glass so hard her knuckles turned stark white. "How can you do this?" Vivian shrieked, the sound tearing from her throat in a ragged, hysterical scream. I am your mother. I carried you for 9 months. I endured the agony of giving birth to you. I fed you, I clothed you, I gave you life. How can you stand there and destroy your own flesh and blood? How can you be so incredibly cold-blooded?" Her voice cracked on the final word, echoing shrilly off the floor-to-ceiling windows. She looked at me with wild, desperate eyes, expecting the biological weapon of a mother's guilt to finally penetrate my armor. She expected me to break, to cry, to suddenly remember some deep-seated familial loyalty and reverse the absolute destruction I had just unleashed upon them. I looked at her ruined face. I thought about the years of emotional neglect. I thought about the constant comparisons to Chloe, the relentless mockery of my ambitions, the deliberate isolation, and the cruel laughter when they handed me a bill I could not pay. I felt no anger. I felt no sorrow. I felt only a profound, crystalline clarity. I leaned forward slightly, resting my hands on the edge of the mahogany table, bringing my face just inches from hers. "My cold-bloodedness," I whispered, enunciating every single syllable with lethal precision, "is a direct inheritance from you, Mother." Vivienne recoiled as if she had been slapped across the face. She gasped, taking a stumbling step backward, her hand flying up to cover her mouth. The absolute, unshakable truth in my words hit her harder than the loss of the mansion or the missing millions. She had created this version of me. She had forged this ruthless monster through years of fire and ice, and now that monster had returned to burn her kingdom to the ground. "Goodbye, Vivienne," I said, standing up straight and adjusting the cuffs of my vest. "Goodbye, Desmond. Good luck, Chloe." I turned my back on them. I did not hesitate. I did not look over my shoulder. The imaginary camera of the room tracked smoothly behind me, focusing perfectly on my structured silhouette as I began the long walk toward the exit. The rhythmic, sharp clicking of my heels against the marble floor sounded like the final gavel striking in a courtroom. Behind me, the room descended into absolute madness. Chloe began to scream again, a high-pitched, agonizing wail of pure despair. Vivienne collapsed against Desmond, sobbing hysterically as she realized she was truly homeless. Brad cursed loudly, kicking a chair across the room in a blind rage. The chaotic symphony of their total destruction echoed loudly, a chaotic blend of weeping, shouting, and shattering illusions. I did not stop. Harrison and the rest of my legal team smoothly fell into step behind me, forming an impenetrable wall of dark suits and quiet efficiency. I walked past the frozen security guards, past the empty reception desk, and stepped out into the main executive corridor. I reached the heavy double oak doors of the boardroom. I stepped through the threshold, stepping out of their toxic world and fully into my own. The doors swung shut behind me. The heavy wood and thick acoustic seals engaged with a loud, definitive slam, instantly cutting off the hysterical screaming and trapping my family inside the nightmare they had built for themselves. The silence in the hallway was immediate and absolute. I took a deep breath of the cool, conditioned air, a genuine smile finally touching my lips as I walked toward the elevators. 6 months later, the world looks entirely different. The view from my new penthouse is breathtaking. The camera of my reality glides smoothly across the open, sunlit living room, taking in the imported Italian leather, the abstract sculptures, and the uninterrupted floor-to-ceiling view of the Atlanta skyline. There is no frantic movement here, no shouting, no shattering glass. The atmosphere is grounded by a deep, resonant peace. I stand near the edge of the balcony, a glass of vintage Cabernet in my hand, watching the city move far below me. The air is cool and clean. I am exactly where I belong. The dust from that explosive morning in the Apex boardroom has long since settled, leaving behind a vastly altered landscape. Justice, I have learned, is not a sudden lightning strike. It is a slow, methodical machine that grinds the arrogant down to fine powder. Marcus learned that lesson the hard way. His entire defense strategy consisted of throwing Victoria under the bus, weeping in front of the judge, and claiming he was nothing more than a naive pawn manipulated by a cunning older woman. He played the victim with the same pathetic desperation he had shown while crawling on my boardroom floor. The federal judge, however, was entirely unmoved by his theatrical tears. The paper trail Harrison compiled was absolute and airtight, detailing every single fraudulent wire transfer and falsified ledger, with Marcus's digital signature stamped firmly at the bottom. Marcus was sentenced to 5 hard years in a federal penitentiary for corporate embezzlement, wire fraud, and conspiracy. His assets were seized, his bank accounts were frozen, and his reputation was incinerated. I occasionally picture him sitting in a concrete cell measuring 8 by 10 feet, stripped of his tailored designer suits and imported cologne, forced to wear a scratchy standard issue uniform. He traded a life of effortless luxury, a life I freely handed to him for a steel toilet and scheduled yard time. His charm, his good looks, and his manipulative words hold absolutely zero currency where he is now. He is just another inmate locked away with the crushing, inescapable knowledge that he threw away a golden empire just to feed his own foolish, fragile ego. Victoria's fall from grace was even more spectacular. She fought the charges tooth and nail, hiring a team of aggressive defense attorneys who bled her remaining hidden accounts completely dry. It was a futile effort. The evidence against her was an avalanche, and the federal regulators decided to make a highly publicized example out of her. She managed to avoid a lengthy prison sentence by accepting a devastating plea deal, but the financial and professional destruction was absolute. She was forced to declare total catastrophic bankruptcy. The government liquidated everything she owned to pay restitution. Her luxury high-rise condominium, her fleet of expensive cars, her carefully curated collection of designer handbags, and every piece of jewelry she had ever flaunted were unceremoniously auctioned off to the highest bidder. Worse than the total financial ruin was the professional execution. The Securities and Exchange Commission handed down a permanent lifetime ban. Victoria Vance is legally prohibited from ever holding an executive, financial, or management position in any corporate entity ever again. The mighty CEO of Apex, the woman who once looked down her nose at me and mocked my business acumen, is now a convicted felon with a shattered resume. Today she works as a cashier at a brightly lit, low-rent convenience store on the far outskirts of the city. She clocks in for hourly shifts wearing an unflattering polyester uniform and a plastic name tag. The woman who used to sign off on multi-million-dollar acquisitions now spends her days ringing up cheap energy drinks, scanning lottery tickets, and bagging stale snacks for late-night commuters. She is subjected to the rude demands of impatient customers standing on her feet for 8 hours a day, surrounded by the smell of cheap coffee and floor wax. The sheer poetry of her new reality is exquisite. Every time she scans a barcode, she is forced to remember the empire she threw away because she thought she was smarter than the woman she tried to steal from. As for the sprawling suburban house I once shared with Marcus, the place I had foolishly decorated with hopes of building a future, it is entirely gone. I put it on the market the very next day after the boardroom confrontation. I did not even go back to collect the custom furniture or the artwork. I sold the property fully furnished to a young, oblivious couple relocating from the Midwest, accepting a cash offer just to expedite the process. I wanted no physical reminders of my past mistakes. I wanted no lingering ghosts of the man who had slept in my bed while plotting to steal my livelihood. The closing papers were signed, the funds were transferred into my holding company, and that chapter of my life was permanently sealed and incinerated. Cutting the final cord to that house felt like shedding a heavy, suffocating skin. I erased every single physical trace of Marcus from my existence, leaving behind a clean, unblemished slate for me to write my own future. I take a slow sip of the rich red wine, letting the complex flavors coat my tongue. The traitors who directly conspired to ruin me have been handled with flawless surgical precision. They are currently serving their respective sentences in the miserable, claustrophobic prisons they built for themselves with their own greed. They gambled against my intelligence and they lost absolutely everything. I set the wineglass down on the marble counter, my gaze drifting away from the sprawling city skyline and settling on the reflection in the glass window. My expression is calm, serene, and entirely ruthless. Marcus and Victoria were only half of the equation. They were the symptoms of a much larger disease that had plagued my entire life. A lingering question remains hanging heavily in the quiet, conditioned air of my luxurious penthouse. It is a loose thread that requires a final definitive cut before I can truly move forward. What about my blood? What about the perfect, untouchable high society Carter family? My gaze slowly pans across the expansive floor to ceiling glass of the window, following the glittering distant lights of the Buckhead skyline. That was where they used to rule. That was the exclusive manicured fortress where my parents believed they had finally cemented their status among the city's elite. But looking at it now, from high above the city, it just looks like a cluster of fragile, meaningless toys. The fall of the Carter family was not just a financial collapse, it was a complete, brutal, and highly public social execution. Desmond and Vivian were evicted from the Buckhead mansion with humiliating speed. When the bridge loan defaulted and the hidden debts were exposed to the merciless light of day, the banks moved in without a single ounce of hesitation. There was no elegant transition, no quiet downsizing to save face. The foreclosure was swift and ruthless. I heard through the grapevine that the bank sent a discount moving crew to clear out their remaining personal effects, unceremoniously tossing Vivian's carefully curated expensive decor into cheap cardboard boxes. But the loss of the real estate was absolutely nothing compared to the loss of their social standing. The prestigious country clubs, the elite charity boards, the exclusive dining societies, every single organization they had spent decades trying to infiltrate revoked their memberships the absolute second the scandal hit the society pages. The Atlanta elite are notoriously allergic to the stench of poverty and public disgrace, and my parents were instantly permanently excommunicated. Former friends stopped returning their calls. Dinner invitations vanished overnight. They were treated like diseased pariahs, completely erased from the world they had sacrificed their own daughter to join. Now the former king and queen of the Carter real estate empire reside in a cramped, decaying two-bedroom apartment in a neglected, high-crime neighborhood on the far outskirts of the city. The contrast is almost poetic. Vivian, who once threw legendary tantrums if her imported champagne was not chilled to the exact degree, now clips grocery coupons and argues with an indifferent landlord about a leaking ceiling and peeling linoleum. Desmond spends his days sitting in a sagging armchair, staring blankly at a small, flickering television. He is a broken, hollow man who realized far too late that his entire identity was built on quicksand, fueled by unearned arrogance and my stolen capital. They are entirely trapped in their own squalor, suffocating in a reality they can never escape. They will never recover. The social exile is a far more agonizing punishment for them than the empty bank accounts. And then there is Chloe. Her golden ticket to the aristocracy turned out to be a poisoned chalice. Brad delivered on his final vicious promise with terrifying speed. He filed for divorce the very same afternoon as the boardroom confrontation. He brought down the full weight of his legal expertise to legally and financially sever himself from her before the ink could even dry on her eviction notice. He left her with absolutely nothing but a mountain of personal credit card debt she had accumulated trying to keep up with his wealthy, sophisticated friends. The designer wardrobe, the luxury cars, the endless spa days, it all vanished in the blink of an eye. Without Brad's bank account, without our parents' stolen money, and without a single marketable skill or an ounce of genuine work ethic, Chloe was forced into the one place she despised most, the real world. My beautiful, spoiled, deeply entitled sister now works a soul-crushing retail job at a mid-tier department store in a dying, rundown mall. The girl who used to drop thousands of dollars on designer shoes without glancing at the price tag now spends 8 hours a day on her feet, organizing clearance racks and pasting a fake, desperate smile on her face for rude, demanding customers just to make minimum wage. I can perfectly picture the brutal humiliation she faces every single day. Her manicured nails are chipped and broken. Her expensive highlights have grown out into dull, uneven roots. Her endless hysterical tears have done absolutely nothing to pay down the compounding interest rates on her massive debts. She is finally experiencing the exact kind of back-breaking, thankless labor she spent her entire life mocking me for enduring. But Brad did not escape the wreckage unscathed. His desperate attempt to save his own skin by throwing my family under the bus did not stop the inevitable. The Securities and Exchange Commission descended upon his boutique wealth management firm like a pack of starving wolves. He is currently drowning in federal investigations, facing multiple severe counts of securities fraud for the client funds he illegally diverted to fund Desmond's bridge loan. His personal assets have been frozen by the government. His prestigious law license is suspended indefinitely. The polished progressive executive who stood in my boardroom and spewed racist venom at my parents is now fighting for his absolute life, frantically trying to negotiate a plea deal that might keep him out of a maximum security federal penitentiary. He is a cornered rat completely consumed by his own impending ruin. They are all completely trapped in the precise, inescapable nightmare they designed. They tried to build their legacy on my back, treating me like a disposable stepping stone, an ugly duckling they could bleed dry to fund their aristocratic fantasies. But the moment I stopped carrying their weight, the moment I stepped aside and let gravity take over, they immediately collapsed into the dirt where they belonged. I take a final sip of my wine, savoring the rich, heavy taste. I feel no guilt. I feel no remorse. I feel no lingering attachment to the people who shared my blood, but never shared my struggles. They earned every single ounce of their suffering, and I am entirely at peace with the destruction I orchestrated. The silence of the penthouse is absolute, wrapping around me like a protective shield. Then the deep melodic chime of the front doorbell rings, echoing sharply through the quiet, empty hallway. I set my wineglass down on the smooth marble counter, the sharp chime of the doorbell pulling me from my thoughts. I smoothed the fabric of my tailored trousers and walked across the expansive, sunlit living room. As I reached the heavy front door and pulled it open, the cold, sterile silence of my solitary triumph was instantly flooded with a profound, radiant warmth. He stood in the doorway, his broad shoulders practically filling the frame. Elias was a towering, deeply handsome African-American man, possessing the kind of quiet, unshakable confidence that only comes from building an empire entirely from the ground up with your own two bare hands. He wore a perfectly fitted charcoal suit, his tie loosened just enough to show he had finished dominating his own boardroom for the day. He exuded a rugged, grounded maturity that commanded instant respect. His deep brown eyes met mine, instantly softening with a familiar, unconditional affection that made the remaining tension in my shoulders completely evaporate. He did not say a word. He simply stepped inside, closed the heavy door behind him, and shut out the rest of the world. Elias stepped up right behind me, wrapping his strong, steady arms around my waist and pulling my back flush against his broad chest. He buried his face in the crook of my neck, pressing a soft, lingering kiss to my hair. The simple, profound weight of his embrace was an anchor grounding me in a reality built on absolute mutual respect rather than manipulation and deceit. I leaned back into his warmth, closing my eyes and letting out a long, shuddering breath I felt like I had been holding for my entire life. This man was my sanctuary. Elias did not care about the penthouse. He did not care about the millions sitting in my holding accounts or the devastating revenge I had just executed. He had loved me fiercely and entirely when I was still playing the part of the struggling, invisible middle child. When my own parents were actively treating me like an embarrassing burden, Elias had seen my raw, unfiltered potential. He knew my secrets before anyone else did. He respected my ambition, nurtured my relentless drive, and stood shoulder to shoulder with me while I quietly built the very financial weapons that ultimately dismantled the Carter legacy. He knew exactly what it meant to fight your way out of the dirt, and he respected the scars I had earned along the way. He never tried to diminish my light to make himself look brighter. We were equals. We were a true partnership. Standing there, wrapped in the genuine warmth of the man who had chosen me when I supposedly had nothing to offer, the final lingering shadows of my past completely dissolved into nothingness. The realization hit me with the force of a tidal wave washing away decades of ingrained guilt and misplaced loyalty. For 30 years, I had agonized over the rejection of people who simply shared my DNA. I had bled myself dry trying to earn a seat at a table that was fundamentally rotten. I had believed that blood bound us together in a sacred pact. But blood was just a biological accident. Blood was the exact reason Vivian and Desmond felt entitled to steal my livelihood. Blood was the excuse Chloe used to demand my subjugation. Blood was the weapon they used to keep me in line. True family had absolutely nothing to do with genetics. True family was not an obligation inherited at birth, nor was it a debt you owed to people who abused you. It was a conscious daily choice. Family was the people who stood by your side when the cameras were off and the bank accounts were completely empty. Family was the man holding me right now, the man who had watched me forge myself into a weapon and loved the fire that fueled me. I opened my eyes, the golden hour light bathing the penthouse in a triumphant cinematic glow. The ghosts of the Carter family were permanently banished from my kingdom. They were suffocating in their self-made squalor, turning on each other like starving animals in a cage of their own design. They had absolutely no power here. Their voices could not reach me, their demands could not touch me, and their judgments were completely irrelevant. I was standing at the absolute pinnacle of my world, surrounded by authentic, unbreakable love. The sweet taste of absolute victory was no longer just about their destruction. It was about my total, unadulterated freedom. I had successfully severed the infected limb, and now I was finally whole. I slowly stepped out of Elias's embrace, my stilettos clicking softly against the polished hardwood floor. I turned away from the sprawling, glittering view of the city skyline, away from the warmth of my future husband, and faced forward. I looked directly into the lens of the camera, my eyes burning with a fierce, unapologetic power, and smiled. The camera pushes in, slowly moving with a deliberate cinematic smoothness. It glides past the imported leather furniture, past the warm, flickering fireplace, and past Elias, who stands a few feet away, watching me with a look of quiet, unwavering pride. The lens isolates me from the luxurious background, drawing closer until it captures every single nuance of my expression. I stand perfectly still, letting the sharp focus frame my face. I am not the broken, desperate girl who used to beg for crumbs of affection at the Carter family dinner table. I am not the invisible workhorse, and I am certainly not the stepping stone they tried to bury in the dirt. My face is radiant, completely unburdened, glowing with a quiet, absolute power and a fierce, hard-won freedom. They called me a failure, I say directly into the lens, my voice smooth, resonant, and entirely stripped of any lingering sorrow. I say the words slowly, letting the profound irony of that label hang in the quiet air of the penthouse. The discarded child. The ugly duckling who was too serious, too boring, too hopelessly unremarkable to ever fit into their glittering plastic world. I take a slow, measured breath, my gaze piercing straight through the glass of the camera. For years, I believed their narrative. I believed I was the flawed equation in a family of perfect variables. I allowed them to charge their luxury cars, their extravagant vacations, and their designer wardrobes to my conscience and my bank accounts, foolishly hoping that paying their endless admission fees would finally grant me a legitimate seat at their table. When you are the designated scapegoat of a toxic, narcissistic family, you are meticulously conditioned to accept the absolute bare minimum. You are taught that your boundaries are an unforgivable inconvenience and that your personal success is a direct threat to their fragile egos. They will demand your unwavering loyalty while simultaneously and actively orchestrating your downfall. But they made one fatal, catastrophic miscalculation. They did not know that the darkness is not for hiding your weakness, I state, my voice dropping an octave, ringing with absolute conviction. The darkness is exactly where you sharpen your weapons. It is where you build your endurance. It is where you map out the exact architecture of your enemies' minds. It is where you quietly, methodically accumulate the capital, the leverage, and the power to permanently dismantle the very cages they try to lock you inside. They thought my silence was submission. They thought my patience was cowardice. They never once realized it was strategy. I let them underestimate me because there is no advantage greater than an enemy who believes you have already surrendered. I think about Vivian and Desmond shivering in their cramped, decaying apartment, entirely erased from the high society they worshipped. I think about Chloe standing behind a retail register, ringing up clearance items while drowning in insurmountable debt. I think about Brad and Marcus, two arrogant, entitled men, currently trading their bespoke Italian suits for standard issue prison uniforms. People think revenge is about uncontrolled rage. They think it is about screaming matches, shattered plates, and chaotic public spectacles. But the sweetest revenge is not seeing them cry. I continue shaking my head slightly, a small knowing smile playing on my lips. It is not watching them collapse onto a boardroom floor, or seeing their fake aristocratic names dragged through the mud in the society pages, although I must admit that was a highly entertaining bonus. The sweetest revenge, the only victory that actually matters, is taking back absolute control of your life. It is severing the invisible, suffocating strings of guilt and biological obligation. It is looking at the people who deliberately broke you and realizing with total clarity that they hold absolutely no power over your heartbeat anymore. It is standing in a fortress of your own making, completely self-made, surrounded only by people who love you for exactly who you are rather than what you can buy them. Blood does not entitle anyone to a front row seat to your life. Respect does. And the moment I stopped treating my abusers like royalty, their entire kingdom turned to dust. I slowly raised my right hand, lifting the crystal glass of vintage red wine. The deep, rich ruby liquid catches the warm golden light of the setting sun filtering through the massive windows. I hold it up in a silent, mocking toast to the ghosts of my past, and a genuine, heartfelt salute to anyone watching who has ever been made to feel like they were not enough. Never let anyone put a price tag on your worth. I declare the words striking like a final definitive gavel. Do not let them diminish your light just because it blinds them. Set your boundaries, guard your peace, and aggressively protect your energy. And above all else, never let anyone dictate your value. My smile widens, transforming into an expression of pure, unapologetic triumph as I deliver the final killing blow, especially those who are living off the very money you made. I tilt my head just a fraction of an inch, holding the camera's gaze with absolute terrifying confidence. I let the silence stretch for one perfect cinematic second. I wink. The screen instantly cuts to black.